So, you've probably heard the buzz about a potential $2,000 check coming from the government, paid for by something called tariffs. It sounds pretty straightforward, right? Kind of like the stimulus checks we saw a while back. But is it actually possible? Let's break down the promise versus the reality of this whole tariff dividend idea. Right, so this is the big question on everyone's mind. Could these checks really actually show up in your bank account? To figure that out, we've got to dig into where this idea even came from, how the math is supposed to work, and, spoiler alert, what the budget experts are saying about it. This whole conversation really got started because of one single post on social media that made a very direct, very attention-grabbing promise. And here it is. This is the original post from Donald Trump on his Truth Social platform. The promise is right there in black and white. A dividend of at least $2,000 a person, and it specifically mentions that high-income folks would be excluded. Okay, so before we get too deep into this, what in the world is a tariff dividend? Well, think of it like this. The government puts a tax on stuff that's imported into the country. Those taxes are called tariffs. The idea here is to take all that money collected from tariffs and just hand it out directly to citizens, kind of similar to how the stimulus payments work. So the idea for the funding seems straightforward enough, right? Just use the money from tariffs. But the claims about exactly how much money is available, well, that's where things get really interesting. The core premise, which came up during a cabinet meeting, was that the U.S. is collecting trillions of dollars from these tariffs, and the plan was to take that massive pot of money and give it back to the American people. Trillions of dollars. I mean, that's an enormous number. And right away, you had budget experts kind of scratching their heads and raising some red flags, all asking the same really important question. Does the math here actually support the promise? And that brings us right to the reality check. We're going to look at what the budget watchdogs and the federal data are telling us and see if the money coming in from tariffs could truly cover the cost of these proposed checks. Okay, so let's start with the cost. According to an analysis by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, sending out just one round of these $2,000 dividend payments to all the eligible Americans, that would cost an estimated $600 billion. Now, for the other side of the equation, what about the money coming in? How much are all of Donald Trump's proposed tariffs projected to generate? Well, that same analysis puts the number at roughly $300 billion per year. And here's where it gets really clear. When you put those two numbers right next to each other, the problem just jumps out at you. The cost of just one payment is literally double the amount of money the tariffs bring in each year. We're talking about a $300 billion shortfall. You know, it's not just us looking at the numbers. Erica York, an expert over at the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, put it about as plainly as you can. She just said, the numbers just don't check out. And that's a sentiment you hear from budget analysts all over the place. So the math is a huge, huge problem. But believe it or not, that's just the start of the hurdles this plan faces. It's also getting some serious pushback, including some pretty confusing messages from Trump's own team and a major, major challenge in the courts. You know, a pretty big red flag for any policy idea is when the people behind it aren't all on the same page. And on this tariff dividend, we're seeing some very different stories coming from the very top. So on one hand, you have the promise of a direct check in your pocket. But then, his own potential Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, suggested this dividend could actually take the form of tax cuts instead. Bessent even admitted he hadn't actually discussed the specific dividend plan with Trump, which really highlights some of the confusion. And if the mixed messages weren't enough, there's an even bigger, more fundamental problem looming. The very legality of the tariffs that are supposed to pay for all this is being challenged at the highest level, the Supreme Court. I mean, you can't overstate how big a deal this is. If the Supreme Court rules that these tariffs are unconstitutional, the government could be on the hook to refund billions of dollars to importers. And in that scenario, the money for the dividends, it just vanishes, gone. Okay, so after all that, the promise, the math, the pushback, the legal challenges, what's the bottom line here? When you connect all the dots, a much clearer picture starts to form. Let's just walk through this one more time, step by step. It all starts with this simple promise of a $2,000 check. Then you hit step 2, the big problem, where the cost is double the revenue. Add in the pushback from conflicting messages and the courts. And that lands you at the final reality. A president can't just do this on their own. This would require a whole new law passed by Congress. So just to put a fine point on it, here are the major roadblocks all in one place. There's not enough money from the tariffs. The messages from the administration are all mixed up. It would need a new law from a divided Congress, and of course, the whole funding source could disappear, depending on what the Supreme Court decides. Which really leaves us with this final question to think about. Is this a serious proposal to give Americans a new kind of financial relief, or is it a really powerful promise that, when you look at the numbers and the hurdles, simply might not be possible to keep?